When first released, Mass Effect Andromeda generated constant debate, and all of it was about which bits of the game were the worst. Everyone was trying to scream over each other to let the rest of the world know just why we should never play it and exactly how BioWare betrayed its own fans. Finally, people have screamed themselves hoarse and we can get to a point where it's possible to play the game without endless comments. So what is it really like? Mass Effect Andromeda is one of the best sci-fi games released since Mass Effect 3. It really is. It's fun, it's engaging, and it continues to be as interesting after the first playthrough. The game has flaws such as endless bugs, but at its core, it's just fun. The cast of characters are unique, and there are no easy comparisons to the original crew. Yes, we have a woman who is Ryder's second, but in personality she is nothing like Lawson. All of the characters have their own complicated backstories, but they also really don't matter. The fun of Andromeda is the adventures this odd crew will get up to, and the stories and new galaxy ahead of them. This crew is strong, all of them have engaging personalities. There's Cora, who could resent Ryder, but tries to find her place to give everyone hope. PB, who has to overcome her own insecurities to join the team. Callow, who is really a kook and a gentle soul. Drac, the aging Krogan, who just wants to protect his family. They all leave strong impressions, and they don't always get along. The characters are figuring each other out just as much as the player is, and that's comforting. It also highlights the huge progress they all make.
I won't bite. I'm not alone. Okay, I won't bite either of you. What's this about? Calla won't find a safe place to land the Tempest. And safety first! You keep me on my toes, PB!
Andromeda got criticism for being a Mass Effect title, but it absolutely is a Mass Effect game. Without Mass Effect, we wouldn't have the Krogan, Turians, Asari, or Solarians. We'd have a bunch of different people who have left a galaxy that nobody cared about. It is undoubtedly a Mass Effect game, and the history lingers, not through random characters which pop up in conversations, but through old animosities and cultures people still carry connections to.
Tiamna used to mean guardian of temples, a champion who stayed faithful even when all was lost. Sarissa left her to die.
Worlds in Andromeda all have individuality and are exciting to explore. There's enough biodiversity to keep the side quests interesting. I hate exploration games, but you don't need to do any extra side quests to level up, and you don't have to craft if you don't want to. The pressure off form of gaming makes the exploration more fun. The quests themselves have had great effort put into them. Some can be wrapped up quickly, but others can see Ryder needing to go across multiple worlds, but at a time whenever the player can be bothered. There are even romance options for characters who never join the Tempest, and although they inevitably get fewer scenes, they are still as compelling. The Ket aren't the greatest villains. The concept is sound and brings biopunk back to Mass Effect, which is so reminiscent of what made the original games great. But the dialogue and the character realizations are weak. It doesn't feel like it matters though, because the main story can take a huge backseat to just getting to know this new galaxy and helping out your crew. And it was the characters that really made the first trilogy so special. The combat is not as great. The absence of the power wheel makes combat feel much more limited. You can change your powers easily, but it really breaks up the flow of fight scenes to have to flick onto the pause menu and assign new powers. Not only that, but it takes away the identity of Ryder. It was great when 3 got rid of the weapons restrictions on different classes, but the classes themselves and their individualism helped the player feel like they really carved out who Shepard was. That's why Liara even references Shepard's class when she writes the commander's name in the stars. Being able to just be any class and have any power makes it feel so much weaker. The distinct powers were frustrating, but in a really satisfying way because it required good strategy and helped the main character stand out in combat. I hate harder combat levels because I'm here for the story, but opening up the options this much actually helped dilute the story. The levels themselves though are a blast. The characters' witty lines help keep even the most frustrating opponent fun to battle against. Unlike the previous games, the different sections have good balance. The combat is fun, but the cutscenes are also interesting. The past games would usually have one stronger than the other, so you might want to rush through one to get to the next stage. Andromeda is light entertainment at every segment. However, one of the most jarring breaks from the original trilogy is that Andromeda feels less like an RPG. This has little to do with the story, because it took 3 games to start seeing big consequences for our actions in the original trilogy. In Andromeda, it's largely down to how Ryder navigates this new arena. Ryder makes the game feel less like an RPG and more like a game like Yakuza, where the choices have already been decided and we're just picking the tone of dialogue. Shepard, particularly from the second game, became a character that the player could truly mould. We could make Shepard whatever we wanted. With Ryder, we're getting a very snarky personality thrust upon us, whether we like it or not. The dialogue options are between cutesy snark or rude snark. It feels much more like we are forging a personality than an identity which will determine the game. And this is where Andromeda's flaws might actually be due to us as fans and our demands. A lot of people hated the old Paragon and Renegade system because some argued there was less reward for being Renegade. This actually wasn't true when the major alliances could all be forged by basically screaming people into submission. What was not rewarded was being a complete dick for no reason. Obviously that burned bridges and ended up with people dying. That's role-playing reality. Those are consequences which would actually happen. It was the best and most political part of Mass Effect. But fans didn't like not being able to treat characters like crap without consequence. This meant that the moral points were stripped and we got a choice of tone rather than the direction in the majority of interactions. It feels much more like we're just shifting between scenes rather than leading them. It gets worse when you actually consider how much weaker the dialogue has become. A seemingly innocuous conversation with Suvi becomes the most critically important point of the game. Suvi talks about God and her faith in a way that could be taken right out of the first game, as Shepard had the exact same conversation with Ash. Until it came to the dialogue choices. In a game about a decade older, you could make a range of choices from I believe too, I don't believe but I respect you, I have no clue, to for the love of a non-existent God, please shut the hell up. There were a range of options that felt like defining a core part of Shepard's canon for the player, even if it had no in-game consequence. It still felt like it mattered. But Ryder can only choose whether to go along with Suvi and express wholehearted faith, or be really rude and then apologise later. We get so much less say in who Ryder is, and it can make it difficult to connect with who we are playing as. It means fans of Ryders will love the game infinitely more than those who struggle to connect with the lead. It is impossible to say to what extent, if any, that the fandom influenced BioWare, but after the success of the original trilogy, there was a huge spike in fanfiction that featured both Shepards as siblings. Unfortunately, one of the worst elements of Andromeda was making it a family drama. This seems to be a bit of a theme of space operas. Star Wars ultimately was at its weakest and most inconsistent when it focused upon the family drama, apart from perhaps when it came to Vader's death. Family dramas are just pointless in space. We want to see the diversity and complexity of the galaxy. That's not to say family at all doesn't work. In Mass Effect 2 there was a good balance because we had to deal with the crew's family rather than Shepard, and often these stories revealed fundamental ideological differences in the galaxy. In Andromeda we just get a load of family angst. The dad dies before we've even been given a reason as to why we should care about him as a character. Then the other sibling spends the majority of the time in a coma. Maybe BioWare realised just how bad the focus on family was by the fact that they removed all of the family members as much as possible from the story. It still comes off as a story that tries to force connections for the player, rather than letting them organically develop. Not only that, but we need to move beyond stories where people are assigned special by their blood. It can enforce white supremacy and is generally incredibly exclusive. It also ruins later stories. Look at the obsession over Rey's parents because fans just can't let go of the idea that anyone can choose to join the fight. They want some reason as to why a woman has to be special, and it comes off as controlling and creepy. Instead, characters should be allowed to flourish on their own terms. I don't care about the Ryder's family legacy, just as I didn't care about whatever Shepard's mother was up to for 3 games. I care about the characters getting to define themselves on their own terms. This isn't The Sims. I don't need to manage a household. But the most bittersweet moment of Mass Effect Andromeda was more about what it provoked in people rather than its own content. Andromeda forced the fandom to finally look at ourselves. It was long overdue and so thoroughly needed, but there was nothing really good to see. Since the release of Mass Effect 3, the fandom had been under an illusion that the backlash was purely BioWare's fault. It was all about an ending that didn't deliver to the loudest fans' expectations. Make no mistake that while gamers generally ridicule anyone who doesn't subscribe to their weird code of masculinity and whiteness, that the main reason that there was such a backlash to Mass Effect 3 was because in no version did Shepard get to ride off into the sunset with his or her love interest. The other big part of the backlash was that none of the endings could be truly considered happy. Everything came down to one final tough choice, which would have deep consequences for the rest of the galaxy. And fans reacted to this ending, which was so true to the core of the story, by starting a hate campaign. But it was okay because it was only about the ending. Except it clearly wasn't. Andromeda showed that the bullying, abusive, toxic and downright whiny behaviour wasn't about the ending. It was about a fandom that had grown completely entitled. The criticisms of Andromeda were largely unfair. Many people have said that they couldn't play the game at the time because everything was so negative. Andromeda also had to deal with pressure that none of the other games had. The original trilogy had nothing to be compared to. Its stories were allowed to stand on their own. Andromeda, though, was constantly being put in the shadow of the first games, even though there is no way possible that one installment could match the depth of progression of 3 other games. But logic, fairness or generosity were never applied to this game or the people that made it. Instead, fans reacted with entitlement and endless videos and blog posts were created about how BioWare had failed to give fans what they wanted. That's not how writing works or ever should work. The negative reactions to Andromeda weren't about calling out a bad game. They weren't criticisms. This video alone demonstrates it's possible to criticise a game while being even-handed and not threatening people, trolling or derailing any wider conversations. Andromeda made it impossible to overlook the fact that the fandom had become the real enemy. That we were the reason that the games could be doomed to fail. And the same is happening with Anthem. It hasn't even been released and yet the fandom is constantly attacking it for not having romances or for not being the next Mass Effect Andromeda after the fans made it clear they weren't interested in a sequel. Andromeda gave us a truth that we could no longer ignore, and a realisation that goes far beyond whether a game can be considered good or bad, because it told us clearly what the problem really was. It's not BioWare, it's us.